Good afternoon. And the earlier session was really interesting. Though translation and I are not at all friendly with each other, not being actually well versed in any of these languages, including English, I was finding it very fascinating, the discussion that was taking place. So thank you for that session. It was very interesting. To give you a small background about what I'm going to speak about is my experience actually working on the grassroots has been with sex workers and sex workers who are female, male, and transgender workers. And at the South Asia level, we have we have a network called Sex Workers and Allies South Asia, SWASA, and much of my talk today is actually dependent on the grassroots level work of SWASA in 4 countries in this region, which is Nepal, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and India. Megha, of course, said that I always speak about sex work, and this time I should speak about LGBTQIA+, and I agreed. And so I'm going to talk about lesbians, gay people, bisexuals, transgender, queer, intersex, asexual, plus talking about the entire fluid, gender fluid populations that we work with. First, I'd like to look at criminalization and what it has meant to us. And people, especially who live on the other side of the dominant norms. We are people who occupy, we are outlawed, and we are persecuted by criminal laws. And much of this has been done to quell our own freedom of expression. Every time we've questioned the state or the law that has been so detrimental to our health and well-being, every time we have demanded accountability from the state when the police and the law enforcement has been so, not just harassment, they have violated all our rights. And of course, when there has been dissent of any kind of democratic expression of our rights. Mostly it has been done to control or deny us life and livelihood. Any behavior that challenges the dominant norm, any kind of sexual preference. In fact, we had slogans that said, judge not, support sexual preference, which talked about bodily integrity, autonomy, self-ownership, self-determination, over our own bodies. I mean, we are not even arguing about the general state. We are only arguing about our own bodies. And even in this situation, there has been we have been denied, controlled, and quelled by the state, which criminalizes our existence. And much of this discussion has been done in the space of public good. And now, of course, public good has in recent years become even the issue of national security, and which is determined by a very authoritarian state. So let's not forget that part of criminalization. We, of course, also face the problem of societal criminalization, right? I mean, so it's not only criminalization by the state. Constantly, our fight is against state and society. So under the guise of protection of individuals, families, so people like us who don't conform to the norm, we are considered people who are practicing a vice and therefore need to be pushed underground. So we have the moral brigade, of course, and very much encouraged by the state. Remember, the moral brigade cannot work on its own unless it has the full support of the state. They've been intolerant and they've campaigned viciously against any kind of deviance. And I'm specifically talking in this situation of trans men and lesbian women who have been hounded by society out of families, out of any kind of umbrella of safety. Let them be single mothers, let them be in pre or extramarital relationships, in multiple sex partnerships, of course, commercial sex, and any kind of erotic sexual performance, preference, the works. And all of this has come under illicit sexual conduct. And the punishment has been extreme. Some violence, abuse, even torture by the state, forced migration, you have to get out of your houses. There have been honor killings by various men in the families. And of course, in many, many situations, it has meant death. So let's look at South Asia. In South Asia, if you can look, I mean, I hope you can see the screen. The amount of reds that you see on this screen actually look at LGBTQIA plus rights in South Asia. And we're looking at Bangladesh, Bhutan, the Indian Ocean, the UK territory in the Indian Ocean, India, Maldives, Nepal, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka. And if you look at same-sex sexual activity across the region, we have either it's been criminalized, like in Bangladesh, Maldives, and Pakistan, and Sri Lanka, or it has recently just been, I wouldn't even say fully legalized, but some kind of reading down of the colonial laws have happened. So we have in this region, you have the whole gamut. You have extreme criminalization and persecution by the state, and you have some parts that have been legal and some parts that are tolerated. So you have this whole gamut here. From the screen, you can see we are looking at same-sex unions, we're looking at same-sex marriages. One, I think, terrible part is this adoption by same-sex couples. This actually is a right that is denied same-sex couples, and it's extremely problematic across the region. There are some countries that have said yes to LGBTQI people being openly in the military. Local activists have really struggled and fought. The case being Sunil Pant in Nepal, for instance. People from the grassroots have fought with their governments to get some kind of anti-discrimination laws in place. And the interesting part, of course, is traditionally we've always had the transgender identity and the transgender expression in this region. Mostly the word hijra has been recognized and used. And of course, there are many cultural connotations to all of this. So some countries have accepted that change in gender is acceptable. And in fact, in Sri Lanka, where I work with sex workers from the transgender community, it is very interesting. On one hand, they can't even go out and, you know, have a performative life. And on the other, you see that the government actually gives you opportunities to be able to change your gender in the local hospitals. So there is this full range that you would see in this on the rights of this community. Why do we challenge criminalization? Why is it that criminalization for us has become such an important part of our lives? Because it's not only the law and law enforcement, it is also society and families that have actually used criminalization to persecute and outlaw our communities. What does criminalization do? It prevents any reporting of violence, let it be economic violence, let it be physical violence, mental violence. Must remember, a large group of male sex workers, transgender sex workers, female sex workers. There's a lot of economic violence that happens because of the work that is involved. There is a lot of physical, mental. There are violations by law enforcers. Even just before 377 was read down in India, we saw a lot of violations by law enforcers who used it. Especially Sri Lanka has reported a lot about this. There was a study by UNDP and UNFPA where we were the technical advisors for that study, and it was done in this region. It was done in Nepal and Sri Lanka. And the violations by law enforcers are absolutely from torture to bribery to corruption, the entire range of violations. Of course, there is absolutely no proper health service access at all. Mostly people who come from these communities have issues with sexually transmitted infections, which they are not even examined for. So even doctors, healthcare providers do not believe that these are human beings who should be actually examined and then given medication for infections that they get while either during their work or during their practice of sexual lives. Of course, the exercise of rights as citizens is it just doesn't exist. What does it do to these people? It crushes them. Stigma, discrimination, tremendous fear. They live in fear. Can you imagine an entire life that is lived in fear? Fear of not only just violence and violations, but fear of just existence, that your choice to live can get impacted by any random person. There are people who live in, who talked about it in Nepal and who talked about it even in India, in various studies that we have done, where not only do you have to run away from home, but anywhere you live, chances of you being outed there and therefore hounded by society and then, of course, law enforcement is very, very high. So you're looking at people who are the kind of mental stress that the LGBTQI community lives with because of this criminalization, and why we are constantly fighting for decriminalization. So what are the consequences? We have found that anybody who challenges these, the dominant norm, are pushed into narrow boxes. They are not acceptable. We have colonial era laws, of course. So we have to deal with public decency, obscenity, morality, public health also very often. I remember right in the beginning with HIV, which is where I started my work with at the grassroots, the kind of discussions on people who were in multiple sexual partnerships or any kind of sexual activity, multiple sexual activity, not only sex workers, gay men, transgender people, the kind of understanding that, they're a public health threat, and therefore they're vectors of spread of HIV and killing decent human beings, was the way it was those days articulated. The fact that much of this community was criminalized and looked at within that lens of criminalization, just helped law enforcers and society to harass this community. And nobody ever thought of ensuring safe environments to live, to be able to look at LGBTQIA individuals as human beings. And I remember, "Are we not human?" was a huge, huge cry that the community had put out. All of this, of course, depends on the regime in power. So either you're tolerating the individuals, or you are overusing and misusing the existing laws. So you have both of this, again, in this region. What does it do to people? It prevents them from organizing. It prevents them from living safely, accessing safe living conditions, access to, say, health services. Access to justice is something that I think even we've forgotten, if that is even possible. And the ability to fight violations. It impacts dignity and it impacts self-worth. Decriminalization. When we were discussing decriminalization, I always feel we need to understand what we mean by decriminalization. Decriminalization is nothing but removal of all laws and statutes that are making you as an individual, because of the acts that you are undertaking, into criminals. We just want those acts to be removed such that these acts are no longer crimes or offenses. So you can only decriminalize if you're criminalized, remember. So much of living was in India before 377 was read down, was criminalized. And the problem with criminalization is that, which is what I talked about right in the beginning, about the state and non-state actors criminalizing, society criminalizing, is even though the state has decriminalized, for instance, in India, society continues to criminalize. And I want to use this language of criminalization for society. What happens with individuals? So please, there's no force, coercion. They can live freedom from fear, from debt bondage and slavery-like practices, because most transgender people today are under some kind of debt bondage, and because of that debt bondage are having to live with slavery-like practice in these large communes, because they don't have any other source of either income or ability to live outside that space. Citizenship rights, of course, and the right to change your gender. I think it is important that decriminalization will bring some kind of legal protection from all discrimination and harassment. The way forward, I really am very impressed by the Yogata Principles on sexual orientation and gender identity that came up in 2007. And in 2017, this was done, of course, by human rights lawyers and activists and community members in Yogyakarta. And then in Geneva in 2017, a bunch of us again got together and we put together Yogyakarta Principles +10, where we looked at not only sexual orientation, gender identity, we looked at even gender expression and sexual characteristics. And I'd just like to, because I just feel that if the community gets language to articulate what they are demanding from the state, at least the dream of decriminalization will be, a reality. So Yogyakarta Principles on SOGI, this was on the application of international human rights law in relation to sexual orientation and gender identity. And this was not to get new legal standards. This was just restating the existing human rights framework and to ask questions of SOGI. What the principles did was they visibilized invisible violence. And they tried to draw attention to international human rights law such that it can respond to the continuing violations experienced by this community. And +10, 2017 saw this adoption of Yogyakarta +10, where 9 new principles were added. The original had 29 principles and about 104 new state obligations and additional recommendations. And what it did was it expanded the markers of discrimination from SOGI to SOGI-esque, which is including gender expression and sex characteristics. So the 29 principles have become a significant landmark, because don't forget that this has been used even in India when 377 was being read down. So we have how the Yogyakarta Principles, how the community got together and developed these principles, which could actually be used in the court to argue for decriminalization. It has been cited by UN agencies, human rights organs, states, judiciary, and various national jurisdictions. And its importance lies in advancing a collective understanding of the relationship between violations and international human rights law. So if you look at principle 1 of the Yogyakarta principle, it says all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. And human beings of all sexual orientations and gender identities are entitled to the full enjoyment of all human rights. I'm sure you can understand the language of the UDHR and how that has been adapted by the principle 1 of the Yogyakarta principle. And essentially, it is to draw on the fact that which is part of the preamble of UDHR, which looks at how we needed the UDHR such that because there has been a disregard and contempt for human rights, which have resulted in barbarous acts, as we all know, of World War I. And don't forget, even then, though we looked at Nazi fascism, don't forget that homosexuals had to wear the pink triangle on their shirts to identify them in the concentration camps also. So they were definitely part of a group of people who were, who barbarous acts were committed against them. So they struggle to establish these rights, you know. First of all, to be accepted as human beings. I think that was the first struggle, you know, which entitled to equal moral consideration. So the principle 1 of the Yogyakarta principle, it makes the important claim that all people, LGBTQIA plus people, are human beings first. They're entitled to all rights that human beings are entitled to under international human rights law. And this was the first articulation that came about in 2007. And this was a struggle. In 1992, sexual orientation as a construct was accepted. But for gender identity to be added to that, it took the Yogyakarta Principles, which came in 2007. And then for us to include sexual characteristics, sex characteristics, and gender expression to this took another 10 years, which is 2017. So the point that I'm trying to make is that none of this would have been possible without activists struggling with their governments and struggling with the UN system to accept language that describes this community and the rights of this community. Sexual orientation and identity. Sexual orientation refers to each person's capacity for profound emotional, affectional, and sexual attraction to, and intimate and sexual relationships with individuals of a different gender or the same gender, or even more than one gender. And gender identity refers to persons' deeply felt internal individual experience, which may or may not correspond with the sex assigned at birth. Now, this is very important, the sex assigned at birth. Please remember, because the doctor takes one look at you and says, oh, you're a boy or a girl. It's assigned by the doctor. But we are looking at gender identity where we are saying that our personal sense of the body has to be different from what the medical, surgical, or other means decides what our body is. So, of course, gender identity also looks at expressions of gender, which includes dress, speech, and mannerisms. How one appears physically, dress, hairstyles, accessories, we added mannerisms to that. Speech, behavior patterns, names, personal references, that gender expression may or may not conform to the person's gender identity. So that is also something we need to understand, that the gender identity may be a particular identity that is being presented, and whatever we are presenting ourselves as may not conform to the to a gender identity. Sex characteristics, of course, physical features, including genitalia and other sexual and reproductive anatomy, chromosomes, hormones, secondary physical features. But remember that we on purpose in 2017, when we were working with Yogata Plus 10, we discussed this word intersex and sex characteristics a lot. And we realized that no, using intersex is actually limiting us. We need to use sex characteristics, which the culturally specific identity categories is not something that you get stuck with. You actually build a normative framework around discrimination on a more universal ground. I would invite you to please look up the Yogyakarta Principles and the Plus 10. There's a lot of stuff over there. I don't have the time to go through all that now. I just thought I should just do this as an introduction to it. We are using the Yogyakarta Principles as a tool of resistance, and which we are setting up a normative architecture around understanding and responding to the violations, fighting with and struggling with governments. So how do we utilize this normative framework as a tool of resistance, such that violence, discrimination, and harm on grounds of Soviesque is stopped both by state and non-state actors. I'd like to acknowledge Arvind Narayan, Pooja Patel, Aarti Pai, and activists from this community who have really helped me understand this issue and also helped me fight back at a very, very personal level. Thank you very much.